Hello, my name is Gwen Gardner, and I'm the High Priestess of the Garden of the Crescent Moon Coven in Kalispell, Montana. Today, I wanted to talk about Freyja. Um, Generally, Freyja, and more specifically, Freyja and her Brisingamen. So, to get started today, I wanted to just go over a little bit of background information about the Norse tradition and the myths in general. The Norse tradition was an oral one for thousands of years. Poets were called skalds, and they followed some very specific rules for creating poetry. They used kennings for everything. It was a real sign of the poet's ability to think of new and different ways to refer to the same old things that they always did: the people, the giants, the dwarves, the deities, etc. Alliteration, which means using words with the same consonant sounds repetitively or similar syllable sounds repetitively, was also used extensively and was also looked on favorably for the most part. This means that many of the myths and sagas are a confusing mess of strange references, obscure bits of information, odd words leading to differing and sometimes unclear or even contrasting translations. Additionally, most deities, dwarves, elves, giants, humans, etc., have many different names which they are called by throughout the poems, and one can only recognize them by understanding the bits and pieces included from other stories about them. The stories that we do have were written down mainly by Christian scholars, as they would have been some of the most literate people of the time, and they were gathered together in the 1200s, around 200 years after the conversion to Christianity in Iceland, with Denmark and Norway being a couple hundred years earlier. So, keeping all this in mind as we go through the story of Freyja and her Brisingamen, as it greatly influences the story as it was actually written down. So, what we're doing is looking for kind of a deeper meaning from what the story might have been before that time. And my version is somewhat less patriarchally influenced than the typical translation from the Eddas. Although, of course, I am using that story. And other stories from some of the Brisingamen story is actually presented in some of the other saga stories. So I'm using a compilation of information in this. So if you haven't read some of the other ones, some of this information might be new to you. So I'm combining some witchcraft thinking in here also, as in like the maiden mother crone type thinking of goddesses. And if we think about it that way, Frey is considered a maiden goddess. She's of the Vanir tribe, which is a nature and fertility tribe, and they were thought to have been matrilineal, or at least matrilocal, and most likely matrilineal if we think about the power that the Norns had and that the seed workers had in society in general. They were typically very honoring of the women, and women had more power and status than in some other areas of Europe, and seem to have been. So that would have been the past history of the people who lived in the area, the Vanir, if you want to think of them as a tribe that might have lived in prehistoric times, in that area, which is kind of how I think about them. I think about the Vanir as being the people that lived in the area, and the Asir as being people that came in, which kind of follows from what we know about history. All right. So, anyways, her uh, her attributes are basically she's thought to represent fertility, abundance, beauty, lust, pleasure, basically all the pleasurable things, which would include areas such as art, music, food, dance, sex, love, having beautiful surroundings, beautiful clothing, fine music, beautiful jewelry, fine tools, vessels, servingware, all of those things that make up culture in a society that's moved beyond basic necessity and has started to develop things just for the beauty of them, right? I mean, they're many of the objects are functional as well, but they're made beautifully. And we know this from artifacts that we found, and in general, the way that they adorned themselves in the past, the people of that area, you know, they had golden hairpins and golden brooches and lots of jewelry and necklaces, and they had they took great care with their hair. They dressed nice. They had several, many, not all, of course, had several uh, different items of clothing, which is unusual for that time period, right? I mean, we're talking about the Middle Ages almost, so medieval times. And anyways, okay. Uh, I'm sorry. When the poems were written down is what I'm talking about, not about when the prehistory of the Vanir. We're getting a little time confusing there. Okay. Anyways, so there's a lot of historians have a thinking about Freyja and her that she was originally Golveg, because Freyja, the name actually just means lady. And so she would have had an actual name, so Lady Golveg, perhaps. So Freyja Golveg might have been her name. Um, so if we go along those thinkings, if she was actually Golveg when she first met the Aesir, um, her her tribe was not originally part of the Aesir, and they lived in the area before the Aesir arrived. We covered that. As the high priestess of her tribe and the highest ranking woman besides her mother, who we think was Nerthus, the goddess who only came out once a year to bless the land with fertility, Freyja would have been chosen to meet the newcomers and attempt some sort of truce or reconciliation between the two tribes as the Aesir moved into their territory. The Aesir being more warlike, aggressive, a patrilineal tribe as opposed to a matrilineal, were apparently and possibly insulted by a woman appearing to conduct these rites, much less a woman who practiced magic. And they attempted to kill her by stabbing her with a spear and hanging her over a fire to burn as a witch. Um, 3 times they did this, and 3 times she was reborn from the flames. The Aesir were terrified by her display of power, all except Odin, who was intrigued, of course, seeing potential and wanting her magic powers for himself. This event was said to have started the war between the Aesir and the Vanir that lasted many long years. So an interesting little side note, the name Golveg can be translated many different ways, but the way that intrigues me is gold, alcoholic, or intoxicating drink, or possibly gold power drink. This, to me, seems like a rather obvious kenning for mead. Um, I don't know if other people see that, but that's how I see it. A kenning is another way to say a word or describe something poetically. Gold is often interchangeable with knowledge in the Norse kennings as something that is considered most valuable to the gods. Amber is also often equated with wisdom. Mead was a golden alcoholic drink and was also considered an inspirational drink of the gods, used in several myths to convey the transfer of knowledge and wisdom, allowing even for the possibility of conferring immortality in one myth, and, at the very least, endowing all who drank of it with wisdom and knowledge beyond the ordinary. So this rather easily becomes the meat of knowledge as a translation for Golveg, to me, in my understanding. The fact that she was called this conveys to us the idea that drinking her in, or partaking of her, or becoming one with her through accepting her drink or her golden power, might lead one to knowledge that could possibly confer immortality upon the drinker of the knowledge. We should keep in mind that the Aesir gods were not immortal when she met them, but she was, as demonstrated by her not only surviving their attempt to kill her, but seemingly becoming even more powerful, transforming into yet another form with another name, Hyde. The fact that she was burned and not harmed tells us that she was probably a sun goddess originally, one that would not be affected negatively by the fire, and in fact might become more powerful in its presence. She was called Hyde, which means bright or clear, after this experience. And the myth says that at that time, she went among the women folk, teaching them the art of seed and magic. So Freyja has another connection with gold, and that is that she's said to cry tears of gold and amber for her lost husband Ode. Ode, which means poetry, song, or inspiration. And Freyja wanders the world under different guises, under different names, seeking her song, her inspiration, her poetry, and weeping gold and amber, which is basically leaving behind knowledge and wisdom as she goes. She is seeking that which makes her, her, her own power, her special magic. Freyja also goes by the name Seer, which means sow or female pig. A pig was considered a very powerful symbol of abundance and plenty in the Norse ancient culture. This shows that she was respected as a powerful figure of plenty and abundance. In one story, she turns her lover into a boar and rides him down to the underworld, waking up a dead vulva, which is a witch or a seeress, to question her about the young man's lineage so that he could gain the throne. Again, she is demonstrating her powers over both life and death by being able to travel to the underworld with ease, wake the dead, and speak with them, and then return. She's most typically described as the goddess of love, even though she is also associated with war and death. She leads the Valkyries, who escort half the dead warriors from the battlefields, and she has her own Hall of the Dead, Sesrumnir, which somewhat loosely translates into seat room, as in many seated room. She is involved with deliberate wars and battles in several of the myths, and no one seems to know why she takes half the warriors, although there is, of course, always the speculation that it is to reward them by offering them all sex and pleasure in her hall. It is likely that this is a deliberate misinterpretation by the monks who were writing down her story and describing her as, basically a loose woman who slept with everyone, which can include being open to different kinds. Oh, I'm sorry. Um, oh, I totally, sorry, lost my train of thought there. Okay, so this is probably a deliberate misinterpretation by the monks, who were trying to describe her as a loose woman, when really her energy is about self empowerment, which can include being open to different kinds of sexual experiences, but doesn't necessarily focus on that. So, appellations like the goddess of self love or self indulgence or self care would actually be much more appropriate titles or names for her. So, in any case, we can see from her various names and actions in the myths that although she is presented as a goddess of all pleasurable things that life has to offer, she actually does not only represent the good experiences that we might encounter, but also some of the not so great experiences, as indicated by her connection to death. In point of fact, she seems to actually represent all tangible experiences in the mundane world that we inhabit, Midgard in the Norse poems, or Earth. Um, so this makes much more sense as we learn more about her. This brings us to the particular story that this talk is sort of mainly about, and another name that Freyja actually went by, which is Menglad, which means necklace glad. Men means jewelry or necklace, and glad, of course, means glad. So this is the name that she acquired after she gained the Brisingamen. name Brisingamen is actually thought to mean fire torque or gleaming necklace. So the Brising part is like the fire, the glowing, the bright, gleaming, right? And then the min again, meaning a necklace, a torque, a bracelet, a piece of jewelry, something like that. Right? So Brisinger meaning like fire or amber, and then of course men mean torque and necklace. All right. So as her story begins, Freyja was out walking one day, as she was wont to do, searching for her song, her inspiration, her poetry, yet again, when she spied four dwarfs working on a particularly lovely piece of jewelry. It was made from gold and amber and other jewels, and twinkled and shone in the light. They had their forge going, fire blazing and air pumping, all of them doing their part to create this wondrous piece of jewelry. Freyja watched as they completed the Brisingamen. She was so enraptured she just had to have it, and offered the four dwarfs anything they desired, if only she could have the Brisingamen for herself. The four dwarfs readily agreed to the idea of a trade, and told her the price would be for her to be intimate with each of them for one night, and the Brisingamen would be hers. So we should pause in the story here to note a few things. These particular four dwarves were named Alfrig, which means king or ruler, Dvalin, which means sleep, hibernation, or unconscious, Berling, which comes from the word bear, giving birth or to produce, and Grer, which comes from groa, to grow. So these names give us an idea of where this myth might be headed if we think about the meanings of the names of the dwarves that she's interacting with. Additionally, we should note that in the Norse myths, which all of the people in the area in the time these tales would have been orally handed down would have been familiar with, there were several references to four dwarves who play very important roles in the mythologies. In the creation story, there are four dwarves who hold up the four corners of the earth. They are named for the four directions: Ustri, Sudri, Vestri, and Nodri, east, south, west, and north, respectively. In many magical practices, the four directions are connected with the four elements: air, fire, water, and earth. All of these elements which are used in smithing. So we're finding these connections, right? Something the dwarves are most famous for is smithing, and something they're actually doing in this story. So the dwarves create all of the magical items of the gods in the myth. Thor's hammer, Sif's golden hair, Freya's magical boat, Odin's ring, etc. Additionally, there are four hearts, or deer, who eat of the foliage of the world tree, and have decidedly dwarfish names as well, whose meanings seem to have to do with the four winds, which the four dwarves of the four directions actually control. Then we have these four dwarves in Freya's story, whom it would seem, if we put all of the ideas that we just talked about together, could represent the elements of air, fire, water, and earth, all of which are involved in the making of the necklace that Freyja is so involved with. So the question that comes to my mind, just immediately, as soon as I read this story, was are these dwarves actually representatives of the earth? We know that the dwarves are thought to live underground, that they do represent earth. They work with earth material, right? And they transform these raw materials into something more fabulous and useful and magical. I think it's an easy thing to think, right? That they are representatives of the elements. So I wrote in my essay here that it seems probable that this is the case. And if it is the case, then what we're really suggesting in this story is that Freyja becomes intimate with the elements of the earth. For her to come to know and to understand and eventually be able to have power with and power over and be able to control the elements. Um, the dwarves who control the winds and those who hold up the four corners of the earth know and understand and can control these elements of the earth well enough to create stunningly beautiful pieces of artwork, which were considered a form of magic at that time. And it's still kind of a magical process for us today. Um, when people create art, it's a magical thing, magical process. So, so with that thinking, we have the premise that the dwarves are actually disguised representatives of the elements, which are all involved in the creation of the Brisingamen. The metal being the earth element, the fire element being the fire in the forge, the air element being the bellows blowing on the fire, and the water element being used to plunge the finished product into order to harden it into its molded form. So all four elements are used by the dwarves with skill and precision to create a thing of beauty and power. This brings to mind, again in my mind, an initiatory experience where one undergoes an alchemical transformation in order to reach a higher, enlightened form of consciousness, to become something new, beautiful, and full of power. At the same time, we don't want to lose focus on Freyja's main concern as she wanders the world. Her walks are not just to get out for some fresh air. She is always seeking her ode, her song, her inspiration, something extra that she has been missing. As the story unfolds, it seems that maybe she has found it at long last. So, to continue in the story, Freyja readily agrees to be intimate with each of the dwarves, the elements as we might start thinking about them, in turn, one for each night, and joins with them then and there to keep her part in the bargain. After 4 nights pass, Freyja is rewarded with the Brisingamen, the fiery, which can translate to sun, necklace of gold and amber of knowledge and wisdom. So the sun necklace of knowledge and wisdom. Now comes the really interesting part. It's if that wasn't interesting enough. We know that Freyja possesses the power of immortality from the many other myths that involve her not dying when others try to kill her, her ability to travel back and forth from the underworld with seeming ease, and the fact that she's the leader of the Valkyrie, those beings who transport the dead to her own hall for the dead, Sessrumnir. When you think about combining her power of immortality with the dwarves' life-giving powers to create, remember the meanings of their names: ruler, hibernation or gestation, giving birth, and growing. Those were the names of the dwarves that she united with. Together, they create a whole new power, one that none of the other gods has, that of restoring life to beings who die, including humans. This is something Odin is very interested in. And in fact, it is the very next story where he has Loki steal the Brisingamen and then forces Freyja into demonstrating this very ability before he will give it back to her. He does this by requiring that she pit two armies against each other, each being revived daily and having to then kill each other again and again and again each day. She does just this, and Odin has to give her the necklace back. It would seem that Odin was trying to gain the new power for himself, but couldn't make the necklace work because he has not actually joined and been intimate with the elements, the dwarves, yet. So it does seem that later on in the story, he does just that, becomes like a woman in order to learn the secrets of Save, the magic of Freyja. But that is another story. In this story, Freyja has just become the most powerful deity of the pantheon. She is not only immortal herself, which the Aesir are not, she is able to confer immortality upon others at will. No other deity in the Norse pantheon has that power. The Brisingamen, the fiery torque, is a symbol of that unique power amongst the gods and goddesses. No one else has ever had anything like it in power or beauty. Even when someone else wears it, as several do in the myths, whether they steal it or it's given to them to help them out in a predicament, they don't get the power that it symbolizes. The necklace is just a beautiful bauble when worn by others. The power it symbolizes has to be earned the hard way. Odin goes through his own initiatory experience to become immortal, and then learns the ways of Seed from Freyja to eventually gain the wisdom, knowledge, and power that she has. But she was the first and maintained that position for a long time. The giants in the myths are always lusting after her in the stories. What they really desire is her knowledge and the power that it confers. Similarly, for all the gods to eventually become immortal, they have to go through their own initiatory experience. And then Freyja has to sleep with them, or be intimate with them, or share her power drink, her golden mead with them. And then they become immortal and can drink from Aegir's cauldron in the underworld and still live. When Loki points out that everyone who is at that final feast and is drinking in Aegir's hall has been with Freyja, he is really on to something. There is a reason that a feast in Aegir's hall has never happened before. Thor had only just completed his own initiatory process and was finally able to join in the feast. There is some question about how the goddesses have been able to attend the feast in Aegir's hall in the underworld. Have they also drank Freyja's intoxicating drink, thus rendering them immortal? They are not listed among the dead at Ragnarok, leading to an interesting question about whether the goddesses ever actually die, or if they have already shared in Freyja's intoxicating drink, learned and practiced the ways of Seed. There is debate on this issue, and forthcoming videos might tackle this. But for now, we know that the Norse gods can die and do die, but they can overcome that and be reborn through their intimacy with Freyja, the goddess who can confer immortality. In conclusion, for us, communion with Freyja, following her example of intimacy with the elements, going through an initiatory event, teaching other women who want to learn our magical ways, doing oracular work, that is, speaking and communing with the dead, and eventually being offered and accepting her golden power drink or mead of knowledge, allowing her to share herself with us and be intimate with us, can lead to us becoming immortal. That is, reuniting our souls with divinity, the ultimate goal of enlightenment in nearly every religion known to have been practiced on earth. There's a powerful secret hidden deep inside this myth. When the early Christian monks and scholars were translating the poem in the year around 1200, such a thing as a goddess, much less a woman, as they were portraying the deities as simple noble people from a long time ago and another country. Having this sort of power would have been the worst kind of blasphemy and heresy against the Christian God and the Church. That anyone besides the Christian God could confer life after death would have been something they would have been desperate to cover up. So the story was turned into Freyja being some sort of sleazy adulterer, greedy, and easily fooled into sexual relations for a mere shiny necklace, parading herself about and sleeping with all the gods. As we have learned today, nothing could be further from the truth about what this myth actually relates to us. So I hope you learned some really thought-provoking things in this video. And if you have questions and comments, please feel free to put them down below or message me, or contact me through my Patreon page. I'll have those links up fairly soon. All right. Thanks again.